Hello writers, come write with me. My name is Michaela Greenwood. I create worlds for mind adventures. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Write with Michaela. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you can go on this journey with me. Today is Friday, which is story time, or the day of our chapter exchange. I am hoping to get chapters from you from either plot. Your work will be extra videos, but everything else will be the same for my viewers. I will label chapters from plot 1 as season 1 and plot 2 as season 2, as I've said before. So it's never too late to write on either one. If you are writing with me and you wish to exchange chapters, then send your chapter with permission to writewithmichaela@gmail.com. I will post the email address at the end of the video, and it should be also in the comment section if you hit the more underneath the title of the video. Please do not send Google Docs. I'm looking forward to reading your chapters, even if I can't read them all on the channel. All chapters read on Fridays, whether they are mine or another writer's work, are copyright protected material, and no one may use any part in writing their own stories. This story is also PG-13, so if you are under 13 years of age, you need parental guidance. This story is in its rough draft stage, just as the last story we heard. The title of this story is Tajiia, and today we are reading chapter 6. If you would like to read along, then send to the email I stated above and request a PDF of the chapter. Make sure you're specific about either City of the Ancients or Tajiia and which chapter. Let's start. Tajiia, chapter 6, Desperate Situations. Shelter's group was closer to the center of the woods. They had to hide quite often to get away from the soldiers. The trees in this part were much taller, and the bottommost branches were very high up. Shelter had to help everyone by dangling magical ropes, because no one had been successful at magically raising themselves to the great height. And they had still been on the ropes when the dogs and soldiers arrived. Both witches in his group had an arrow, one in the arm and one in the shoulder. The mentee was unharmed as of yet, and Shelter was unharmed. Shelter looked down and watched as the archers shot their arrows up in the air. Several made it to their height, but several didn't make it. And as of yet, no one had removed the arrows from the two witches. Then Shelter saw the raven flying around and circling. He thought to himself, ravens aren't like vultures. The raven landed in a nearby tree. Then Shelter watched an arrow shoot up towards them and suddenly turn back and greatly speed up. His eyes widened as he saw the arrow strike the archer. Shelter watched in amazement as the other soldiers and archers turned to look at their dead comrade. Then the lead commander shouted up, "You will pay for that, warlock!" Shelter thought to himself, pay for what? He glanced around at his group when they suddenly vanished from sight. "You coward! Show yourself!" shouted the commander. Shelter looked down at his body, and he could not see himself. Then he looked down at a handler, and the handler looked like him. He touched his own face to assure himself that he was still alive and still in the tree. The commander looked up in the tree, and then looked at the handler. The handler saw several soldiers drawing their swords. He glanced around and saw his fellow comrades, only they looked like the people they had seen in the tree. He immediately released his dogs as he thrust his hands forward and shouted, "No, it's a trick! I'm Travor!" It was too late. Several soldiers cut down several handlers, and never did they stop and process that there had been 4 people in the tree, but there were 12 on the ground. The remaining handlers grew scared, and when a soldier turned towards one, he would give his dogs the commands to attack the soldiers. The horses tried to stomp the dogs, which dislodged several soldiers. Once the horses had no riders, they took off into the woods. Chilter just stared down. When the raven landed in his tree, he nearly jumped clean through his skin. Arswaya noticed the floating arrows right away. She thought, Tajiia, we have to deal with the arrows. She glanced down at the ground. Make them small and visible so I can see them. Tajiia did as Arswaya asked, and she slid herself and Arswaya onto the branches. Wolof, please help me get the arrows out so we can ride the raven, Arswaya said quietly. Wolof nodded and carefully made his way toward the 2 witches. He was in such shock that he didn't think to try to get the arrows out. But now he followed the directions Arswaya gave him. With everything smaller, it was easier to break the shaft of the arrows and pull them out. Arswaya said quietly, the archers have laced the arrows with poison, so they will need care. We will get them to the tree on the plains, and Tharkek will do what he needs to do there. Tajiia? Tajiia once again raised people up onto the raven's back, and they headed off. Wolof glanced down to the commotion that was still taking place. He shook his head to himself. He had been a warlock for a couple of years, and had passed several tests, but the dogs scared him, and he was wondering why he ever chose this path. They were nearly out of the woods when suddenly another raven started circling around with the raven they rode. The 2 ravens landed in a tree. They soon realized that Tharkek was on the other raven. Tharkek shouted, Tajiia, release them and I will tie them on this raven. I have the tying down now. Arswaya thought to Tharkek about the 2 witches' wounds. Then once again she and Tajiia were sailing back into the woods. They had 2 more groups. Arswaya was hopeful because Tajiia was able to do many things that the witching community hadn't been able to do in a long time. But she felt Tharkek's impatience and knew he was right. They had found Tharkek's group before archers had shot arrows. They found Wykart's group after archers had shot arrows and a minor injury. Now archers had shot 2 witches. Thankfully not fatally, but still worse. Arswaya told herself to concentrate on hope. Then Arswaya tried to think of the next group leader's name. She remembered Cessny and thought the name to Tajiia. Tharkek landed in the tree. He checked on everyone and got himself and Chiltor's group off the raven. He then consulted with Girton and asked if he could help the witches. Girton agreed, and then Tharkek quickly left on the raven. The group in the tree watched the raven fly off. They felt much safer than they had in the woods, but they still didn't feel safe. Arswaya gasped as they came upon Cessny's group. She saw dogs fighting over the bodies of 2 warlocks, and she saw Cessny shooting off spell after spell. The mentee Grana was also casting spells. Arswaya saw dead dogs littered on the forest floor. Then her heart almost stopped. They had not yet landed in a tree, and dogs from all sides of Cessny and Grana leapt up to attack them, and no magic was coming out of either of the 2. As the dogs were coming against Cessny and Grana, the 2 shrank down to be as small as dirt. The dogs were confused and started sniffing around. They growled at each other. Cessny and Grana grabbed each other. They were scared beyond belief. Then suddenly they started floating up. The dogs looked enormous and very frightening. The soldiers were frantically scanning. They felt they should see bodies. They glanced at the other 2 piles of dogs as the dogs started fighting over who got to eat the bodies. The commander instructed the handlers to search the last area they had seen the witches. As one handler approached the area, a dog began growling at him and wouldn't let him closer. So he hollered, "Mavor, call off your dog." Mavor headed over right away, but the dog growled at him too. Mavor glanced at the dogfight over the one warlock's body, and as he glanced away, his dog leapt at him and bit him in the neck. He yelled at first, and then his sounds became garbled. The other handler ran away from the spot, and as he ran, dogs jumped on him from behind. The horses were getting fidgety, but the soldiers maintained tight control. When Cessny magically raised up on the raven, she was near panic. But then she saw Arshwaya. "Oh, Arshwaya," she cried. "Shh," cautioned Arshwaya. "It wasn't your fault." The raven lifted into flight, circled the carnage below, and then left. Arshwaya didn't want to leave the bodies of the warlocks, but there wasn't much left of them, left of either of them. Arshwaya blamed herself for their deaths, because she had divided them into groups and shouldn't have. Then she let Tajiia bring her group to Artur, instead of going immediately to find the rest of the groups. She let out a sigh, and she received these thoughts. You did not train your dogs to attack, and you did not turn your dogs to attack warlocks based on pure prejudice. I don't think the blame falls on you either. Tajiia, thought Arshwaya. Yes, thought Tajiia. Thanks, let's get them out of here. The raven glided along between the trees. They met Tharkek again, but they weren't as close to the edge this time, and both knew what was going on when the ravens landed in a tree. Tajiia didn't need prompting. She just sent the 2 witches over, and then they took to flight again. Cessny was frightened when she floated away from Arshwaya, but she relaxed when she saw Tharkek. Arshwaya thought to Tajiia, the only name I can remember for the last group is Waggler. When Tharkek got to the tree, he counted 11 witches and warlocks. He consulted with Girton to see how the 2 witches were doing. Both needed more medicine than he had, but for now they were doing fine. Once again, he took to flight to find Arshwaya and Tajiia. Arshwaya was horrified when they flew in closer to Waggler. She didn't understand why he wasn't in the tree. The dogs were devouring 3 corpses, and double or triple the number of dogs that attacked Cessny and Grana were attacking Waggler. Waggler was an unmistakable warlock. He was close to 6 feet tall. He was broad-shouldered, and his hair was bushy. His hair was shoulder-length, and all his curls made his head look like a puffed-up ball from the back. Arshwaya's heart once again threatened to explode out of her chest, but then she noticed that the dogs looked like they were on a skinny haystack, and they were sliding down, and Waggler was still standing. Waggler looked shocked as he quickly glanced around at all the dogs that he thought should be eating him now. The dogs went to attack again, and this time the haystack of dogs looked bigger because the wall was wider. The dogs fell back again, and the handlers shouted to attack again. The dogs charged quickly, with teeth bared. This time the haystack rose in the air, and the haystack flung the dogs away. The soldiers gaped up at the floating warlock, and then they saw him blink away. Waggler looked all around himself. It seemed like the woods just grew. Trees were much taller than he'd ever seen them. He felt himself floating in the air, and he really couldn't control his motions. When he floated in the tree branches, he saw a huge raven, and he panicked. He tried swimming in the air to get away from the bird before it had the chance to mistake him for a bug and eat him. The next thing Wagler knew, he was landing on the back of the raven, and Arshwaya was telling him to calm down. A magical rope tied him to a feather, and Arshwaya told him to hang on. Then the raven flew out of the tree. Wagler strained his neck to look back at the scene he thought was going to be his death scene. Then he relaxed and held on. It would still take a while for his heart to slow, or his breathing to return to normal. When Tharkek met up with them, he felt the solemnness from Arshwaya, so he didn't say or think anything as the two ravens headed back to the tree on the plains. It had taken several hours to get all the groups to the tree, but it didn't take long to get everyone tied on and to head to Artur's group. Artur didn't know they weren't bringing each group all the way, and he became concerned at the length of time. He turned back and scanned the skies again. He saw two ravens flying in, but he knew they had left on blue jays. The ravens landed. Half of Artur's group became visible, and people were calling out numbers of 500, 1,000, 600, 1,000, and 730, 1,000. Artur raised his eyebrows. The longer the time, the farther apart the numbers were. Then the other half of his group became visible, including himself, and people shouted out similar numbers. The ravens took to the air, and Tajiia reversed the spell, so the 15 of them were no longer small. Artur did a quick count and realized right away that 5 were missing. But he didn't say anything because everyone but Tajiia looked rattled. Arshwaya inquired right away if anyone had something against the poison from the arrows. Shaful and Belshum did, so they helped the two witches and Romur, Girton's mentee. Artur watched Tajiia, and she didn't seem too concerned with the poison. He looked at Arshwaya and received these thoughts. She originally got me because she didn't know what to do with the people I put in her group. Don't worry, she'll get there. Artur just nodded his head. After Shaful and Belshim properly dressed the wounds, the group of 38 people headed northeast. They had lost 5 people that they knew about, but the dogs wouldn't be able to follow their scents unless they found the other end of the rabbits' tunnels and picked up their trail from there. Many stayed lost in thought. Some were exchanging stories. None were practicing their new spell yet. Tharkek wanted to know what Tajiia did to the dogs. So after some time he asked, Tajiia, what magic did you use on the dogs to cause the dog fights? Tajiia glanced back and raised her eyebrows. Eg kvet calcium sinus. I didn't train the dogs, she said as she stopped walking. She turned back to look at Tharkek, and after a few seconds she said, the handlers underfeed those dogs, and they maltreat them, at least according to the dogs in my village who managed to escape. She paused as she translated, and then she said more. The dogs have no loyalty to those masters or each other. One dog in my village said he escaped when the handlers were creating dog fights for sport. Dogs fight to their death. I think the handlers do that to somewhat reduce the dog population, because there are too many dogs. She glanced at Raisler, who nodded approval. Eg kvet calcium sinus. I didn't train the dogs, she restated. When we got to you, the dogs were already jumping up at the tree. The handlers didn't have control of them, so I just pressed them closer to the tree until the close confines proved the fight. Tharkek didn't know how to respond as he recalled the scene of the dogs below him, and as the group stopped around them. Several glanced around, and they thought about the witch Tajiia had spoken. Tola leaned over to Telka and whispered, "We need to write things down so we remember the words." Ozzy glanced at them and decided that she wanted to write things down as well. "I think," started Arswaya, "that the tree had a lot of branches and thick foliage for you. I think the archers couldn't see you. That's why they weren't shooting yet." "That's true," reflected Tharkek. "And the tree Whitecarl was in had less foliage." "Shelter's tree had foliage," stated Arswaya, "but the branches were long, and the foliage didn't conceal them. Their advantage was the branches were so high up." Shelter nodded, but he thought about the disadvantage of the branches being so high and the people in his group not being able to float up to that height. He knew he could not have had more people in his group than he did. Arswaya turned to Cessny and Wagler. "But that was a disadvantage to you, since you never made it in a tree." Cessny shook her head, and her long golden curly hair waved with each shake and waved in the wind a bit more. "We didn't even have time to try," stated Wagler. "The dogs were upon us before we said the first words of our spells." Ozzy's eyes widened. She looked around at all the speakers. "That's why we need short spells." Tajiia was shaking her head no. "No," said Merk. "We use short spells because of memory." He looked at Tajiia to see if she would say anything. Tajiia just shook her head no again, and her original group was watching her closely. "No," she said finally. "It's not a matter of short or long. It's a matter of right or wrong. I used the wrong spell for," she pointed at Cessny, "for her group. I needed a wall, but I made them small because that's what we keep doing, and the dogs were," she was shaking her head more vigorously, "the dogs were eating people." Artur perked up. He now knew that things did bother Tajiia, but she was very good at concealing it. He would have to pay more attention. "I," started Tajiia. "Tajiia, dear," started Arswaya, "your spell worked. You still saved Cessny and Grana." "You saved us all," stated Tharkek. "I was looking down at the dogs and not having any idea of what to do." He looked at Chancellor Whitecarl. "Don't tell her any rules for any test, because she just comes up with solutions. We don't need to limit her to how we have learned to do things." "And," started Artur, "some of us have rules that we use which simply aren't true. Like, a spell can only be 3 to 5 words long. That isn't true, but many believe that." "She also had a bit of knowledge about the dogs," stated Verant. "I've seen the images of what some of you went through, and prior I had heard the dogs were vicious, but I had no idea their training." "Tajiia talks to the animals," stated Arswaya. "If she didn't, we wouldn't have been able to communicate at all." "We need to keep going," stated Raisler. "We can walk and talk." "Yes," agreed Artur. "We must keep going, because we need to plan to rescue the rest from the villages. I'm afraid pretending not to know anything may not help us this time." "Yes, let's get the mentees to safety first," stated Arswaya. Their group once again headed northeast, but for the most part, there was no talking. The sun started its descent, and most had nibbled on their sparse rations. But the continuous walking wasn't normal for any of them. So when the shadows stretched and then started blending together, they were looking to sit down or lay down. Tajiia stopped and turned back. She scanned the plains. The group stopped, and Artur, Raisler, Tharkek, and Arswaya watched Tajiia. Artur especially watched her. He heard the squirrel chattering in her ear and saw her nod her head once. Then the squirrel jumped off her shoulder and scampered off. Arthur glanced over at Ozzy, who currently held the rabbit, and the rabbit was wiggling to get down. Once down, the rabbit started nibbling on the grass. Tajiia glanced up to the skies and then looked to the ground. She sat down. The rest of the group took their cue, and they sat down too. Tajiia was watching the way they came, and far away she saw people in a village. Suddenly, Tajiia sprang up and yelled, "What? What are you doing? Why would you give my name?" Raisler rushed to her, put one arm around her waist, and covered her mouth with his other hand. "Don't respond to the vision. Just watch it." Tajiia turned back to Raisler, and Raisler released her. "What do you mean? He's right there." She pointed, and then she looked, and nothing was there. She didn't see the man or the village, and she put together that they were far away from any village. She turned to Raisler. "I saw him. He was at the tree, but now he's telling the soldiers my name." Raisler glanced to where she pointed and then back to Tajiia. Has this ever happened to you before?" "I'm not senseless," stated Tajiia. No, I know that. But," started Raisler. He glanced over to Arshwaya and Tharkek. Arshwaya headed closer. "What he means is that we have to give you information about this if you don't know." She looked at Raisler. "Do you know if she is 12? "I believe she said 11 and a half, stated Raisler. Tajiia relaxed and listened as they said 12. Her parents had told her that 12 was an important number for her. "Okay, well," started Arshwaya, "it seems you're a little ahead, but some witches and warlocks get visions." "Visions aren't set," put in Artur. "No, they aren't set," agreed Tharkek. "What did you see?" asked Arshwaya. The man, warlock, that had a girl student, mentee, that tested the wind paper test," started Tajiia. Many people raised their eyebrows as they thought of who it was, who it could be. "Dussler?" asked Tharkek. He looked at Chancellor Wycart, who raised his eyebrows and slightly shrugged his shoulders. Tajiia glanced over. "I guess. I don't remember all the names. Anyway, he was walking up to the soldiers and telling them my name. He told them I was the witch they wanted, and I had been the one to set up this strange area." "Was he in a village when you saw this?" asked Arshwaya calmly. "Yes," replied Tajiia. Arshwaya looked at Tharkek. "We have to go." "I agree," stated Tharkek. Arshwaya looked at Artur. "Will you be okay?" "Yes," replied Artur. "Actually, even more so now that we've gotten a few lessons from Tajiia." He smiled and nodded at Tajiia. Arshwaya turned to Tajiia. "Can you call a bird?" "Most birds have gone to roost," stated Tajiia. "If I see an owl or a bat, that's fine," replied Arshwaya. "They would generally leave right away, but they could sleep through the night and then find a bird in the morning, and the time of arrival wouldn't be that different. When you can talk to a bird and have the bird agree, then we will head to Dussler's village." Tajiia glanced around and then sat back down. The squirrel came and dropped a nut in her lap and then scampered off again. Tajiia picked up the nut and looked at it and then put it back down. Soon Ozzy was sitting beside her. "Do you like jerky?" Ozzy asked. Tajiia slightly shrugged a shoulder. "Here, I bet you are hungry," said Ozzy as she handed over a piece of jerky. "Thanks," replied Tajiia. She ate the piece of jerky and then motioned Alla over. She touched Ozzy's knee to indicate Ozzy should stay and participate. Then she held up a finger and stood up. She looked at Artur and wrinkled her forehead. She held out her hands to him. Artur didn't understand. Tajiia glanced around, all in the group. Then she faced north and held her hands up like a frame, and then she turned south and released her hands. Then she ran her hands along an imaginary rectangle, and she sat back down. Atur was curious, so he slowly got up and strolled around the different clusters of people. He would make his way to the rectangle of air in a bit. Tajiia cupped her hands before herself and indicated that the two girls should do the same. Soon more people were sitting in a circle around them, and several had paper to write things down. "Sands of time," Tajiia said in human. Ozzy repeated it and then looked at Allah. Allah repeated it, and the people around them in the circle repeated it. Tajiia looked around the circle in front of herself and sighed inwardly. Having so many people around her certainly wasn't normal for her. But she felt somewhat connected to Ozzy and Allah. 360 grains, everyone repeated. Fire of light and... Fire of heat and fire of light, stated Tajiia. Merk leaned over to Chancellor Wyckolt. "I think she's giving answers to test," he teased. Chancellor Wyckolt looked at Merk with his eyebrows raised. "Dance in my hands," stated Tajiia. Everyone once again repeated, "And go to where I send you." Everyone in the circle repeated. Atur was on the other side of the rectangle of air, and he could not see anyone. He was impressed and amazed. "Now in which?" stated Tajiia. She stood and said loud enough for all in the circle to hear her. "Aryan ab Taj, Tasin Sadin Pithan, Fusir ab Kalins, o Fusir ab Lutz, Balais I Iguas Dintan, o Vais a Plot Egg Invu Ut." Atur heard the words and knew he should see some light. He backed away from the wall. He wanted to see how much coverage they had. A huge flame erupted in Tajiia's hands. "But," started Ozzy. Merk put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't interrupt." Everyone in the circle gawked at the fire she held. Some scooted back. They saw Tajiia slightly rotate her left hand under the flame and then motion with her right hand. Small balls of fire with 2-foot-long tails jumped out of the flame and circled back to the fire she held. The rabbit jumped into Ozzy's lap and hid her face. The squirrel jumped in Allah's lap. Then the squirrel ran around Allah and jumped in her lap again. After a minute, Tajiia clasped her hands together and the flames were gone. She said, "Gratless ut." Atur made his way around the rectangle just as the flames disappeared. Chancellor turned to Merk and said, "That is not the answer to any test." Merk laughed. "That is how she passed the first test." "She used sands of time?" asked Chancellor Wyckolt. Several looked at Tajiia. She wrinkled her forehead and thought, "No, I don't think so. But out here on the field, I didn't want the flame longer than a minute." Everyone looked south across the field, and then back to Tajiia. "If anyone was out there," started Atur, "they saw nothing. The light didn't show even at the edge of the air." "The edge of air?" asked Bullock. "I think we've had enough lessons for today," stated Varant. The group got up to move a bit away to sleep for the night, but Tajiia grabbed the hands of Ozzy and Allah. The rabbit and squirrel had no lap, but they had no flames either, so they went about their own things. Once everyone was farther away, Tajiia said, "Your turn." And yes, the flame was bigger tonight. She looked at Ozzy. "Because no matter your words, there has to be intentions and or pictures in your mind of what you want." Ozzy nodded. She cupped her hands and whispered the words. Flames sprouted up in her hands. "Look at her flame," Tajiia said to Allah. "Picture that in your mind and not your fear. Just stare at the flame." Allah did. She cupped her hands and concentrated on Ozzy's flame. She whispered the words without once thinking it might not work. And suddenly flames sprouted up in her hands as Ozzy's went out. The flames in her hands startled Alla, but they also excited her. She glanced to her mentor and saw that she was watching. Her mentor smiled at her. After the flames went out, Tajiia pressed her own hands together and slightly bowed her head. Grotless ut. Grotless ut. Ozzy and Alla repeated, "The universe bends to our wills, but we must be grateful," stated Tajiia. Ozzy and Alla nodded and then headed back to their spots. Alla was very happy. She had worked her first spell. Okay, writers, that is the end of chapter 6. Tajiia helped rescue groups, and most everyone made it out of the woods, and they are calming down. Then Alla worked her first spell. I think that was a nice ending to this chapter. Leave a comment below on how your stories are coming. State plot 1 or plot 2, how many chapters you have. If you only have one chapter because you haven't slid off chapters yet, then you can leave a comment on the number of words or the number of pages. To me, I prefer word count because I think that's more accurate, because you can break off a whole bunch of chapters and that would increase your pages. Currently, Tajiia is 93,684 words, and it's 236 pages. Like I said, the number of pages depends on how many chapters. If you break off more chapters, you're going to have more pages. So it doesn't tell as much. And the genre that I'm working in takes between 80,000 and 120,000 words. So I'm in that with that 93,000. Also, many writers, this includes you, have a goal of so many words per day. The most common one I have heard is 500 words a day. My goal is actually an average of 500 words a day. Some days I may read and edit more and put in 20 words. And the next day I may drop in a couple thousand words in a story. So for me, the average seems fair. So long as I'm working, I'm still working on my writing, my books, and I have a measurable goal because I can get the average in an Excel sheet very easily. In fact, at this point in the year, I have around 944 words per day average. So I'm doing very well. Last year, however, I only had an average of 232 words per day. So that wasn't so good. This year, I have put in better routine and things are working for me. Leave a comment below on what is your writing goal. Okay, you don't have to have 500. You might could have 100. But is it 100? Is it 500? Is it 1,000? Just leave your goal. I hope you are enjoying writing your stories because it's not just about word count. It's about having fun. Don't forget to share your stories by sending them to writewithmichaela@gmail.com. Join me Tuesday for a writing prompt or some more jargon. I think at this point I decided to expand your cave. So I think I told you that on Tuesday, to find your cave, where we wrote about a scary cave and a peaceful cave. So I think that's what we're doing Tuesday. Join me Friday for chapter 7 of Tajiia for wind protection. Visit my website, bymichaela.com, and read some character bios. You could meet Francesca, aka Izzy, in Operatives. She's a fun character. I love writing with her in scenes. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and the bell so we can continue to write together. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your participation. If you know someone who would like this video, then please share it with them. This is Michaela with Write with Michaela. Bye for now.